I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles had opened countless royal papers carrying the weight of history, but this one stopped him cold. Hidden among Queen Elizabeth II's privately sealed correspondence was a letter written in unmistakably personal language, and Catherine's name appeared at its emotional center. As Charles read his mother's final promise to the Princess of Wales, his expression changed from disbelief to pain, because fulfilling Elizabeth's wish could force him to make a choice that would wound someone close to him. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles read the page again, slower this time. The envelope had surfaced during a private review at Windsor Castle, where generations of family records had been preserved. It carried a strict instruction: release only when Catherine reached greater responsibility within the monarchy. That condition mattered, because the Princess of Wales was being prepared for the future role of Queen beside William. The king reached the sentence that changed everything. Elizabeth had promised Catherine a chosen collection of private royal jewels, family keepsakes, and a confidential ceremonial responsibility meant to show her trust in the woman who would one day stand beside the future sovereign. A ceremonial responsibility, in simple terms, was a formal royal duty tied to tradition and continuity rather than political power. Charles understood that this was not a sentimental gift. His mother had built meaning into every part of it. Charles lowered the letter and said nothing. An aide remained nearby while the monarch read the same passage for a second time. Catherine knew nothing about the promise. Camilla would inevitably feel its weight. William would see what his grandmother had intended for his wife. And Charles, trapped between memory and loyalty, would have to decide whether obedience to the dead queen could wound the living one beside him. Then the final wording tightened the trap. Elizabeth had written that the promise was not to be diluted, divided, or reinterpreted after her death. The king could not simply soften it into something easier. Worse still, a handwritten paragraph suggested she had feared Catherine might someday need protection from competing palace interests. That line disturbed him more than the jewels ever could. Charles finally asked for William to be brought to him privately. But before the prince arrived, another message reached the room. Camilla may already have known that Elizabeth intended something significant for Catherine. The discovery changed the danger entirely. Charles could carry his mother's burden alone for only so long. But once William and Camilla entered the secret, the hidden promise was about to become a deeply personal family reckoning. The letter did not simply place Catherine at the center of Elizabeth's final wishes. It placed Charles between the three relationships that defined his present life. His wife stood beside him as queen. His son represented the monarchy's future. And Catherine had earned Elizabeth's trust through years of restraint, duty, and private loyalty. Now one dead monarch's promise threatened to force the living king to decide whether protecting peace mattered more than preserving his mother's exact intentions. William entered Charles's private room and knew at once that something had shifted. The king did not explain. He simply pushed the letter across the desk and watched his son read. As Prince of Wales, William stood first in line to inherit the throne after his father, which meant every decision involving Catherine's future role touched both family and succession. His eyes slowed when he reached her name. The prince did not smile. He did not celebrate. He asked one question: did Catherine know? Charles said no. William looked back at the page, then told his father that she had to hear Elizabeth's words from him directly. Catherine had spent years growing from royal newcomer into Princess of Wales, carrying expectations once linked to Diana while building a quieter bond with the late queen. That made the promise emotional, but also dangerous. Charles watched his son notice another detail. The letter separated certain jewels, keepsakes, and responsibilities from anything that would automatically pass to the reigning queen. Camilla now stood beside Charles in that role, so the distinction could easily feel personal. The king admitted there was more. Elizabeth had arranged separate documentation to protect her wishes if anyone inside the family later challenged or tried to reinterpret them. William's expression hardened. Separate documentation meant supporting written instructions designed to confirm and preserve the original decision. This was no casual note. Elizabeth had anticipated resistance. The prince asked why his grandmother believed Catherine needed that level of protection, and Charles fell silent because the answer reached beyond inheritance and into a family wound. William folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the desk instead of keeping it. Then he told his father, firmly, that Catherine must never believe she had caused a division between them. Charles understood the warning. His son was not defending property. He was defending his wife from becoming the symbol of a conflict she had never created. The question now hung between them. What had Elizabeth seen that made trust alone feel insufficient? To understand that, Charles and William would have to return to one night when the late Queen decided that a promise needed more than affection. It needed protection alone. Years before Charles discovered the sealed letter, one private evening changed Elizabeth's view of Catherine forever. It was not a coronation, a balcony appearance, or a carefully photographed royal engagement. It was a difficult family moment behind closed doors, when competing expectations over Catherine's future role suddenly collided. Elizabeth watched how Catherine responded when pressure was highest, and what happened that evening became the hidden trigger for the extraordinary promise Charles was now struggling to honor. Elizabeth had watched Catherine for years and understood something others missed. The younger woman could absorb criticism without turning tension into spectacle, and she repeatedly chose continuity over recognition. As William moved closer to becoming direct heir, meaning the next person expected to inherit the crown after Charles, Catherine's ceremonial future became more important. Questions grew over which traditions, objects, and responsibilities should eventually pass into her care. Catherine felt the pressure before anyone named it. Comparisons with Diana made every symbolic gesture heavier, while expectations about becoming queen threatened to turn duty into competition. She preferred gradual preparation and resisted anything that looked like dramatic elevation. Elizabeth noticed that restraint. The late monarch did not read it as weakness. She saw a woman refusing to fight for status, and that refusal deepened her trust. Then one Windsor evening changed everything. After a major state reception, a private family discussion turned tense over whether Catherine should immediately take stewardship of several ceremonial pieces traditionally associated with senior royal women. Stewardship meant being entrusted to preserve and responsibly use important objects rather than personally owning them. Catherine refused to argue. She offered to step away from the discussion. Elizabeth stopped her before she could leave. According to the documented account preserved with the sealed instructions, the Queen dismissed aides, asked Catherine to sit again, and closed the door herself. She told her that refusing to compete for status was exactly why certain responsibilities should belong in her hands in the years ahead. Catherine did not celebrate. She listened, shaken by those words. Within days, Elizabeth dictated the first version of the instructions Charles would eventually discover. The document was designed to survive disagreement and prevent household politics from overturning her decision. That changed everything. This was not a sentimental note written in passing. The monarch had anticipated resistance and built protection around Catherine before anyone knew it would be needed. Charles now understood why his mother had been so precise. The past had explained Elizabeth's reasoning, but it also identified the next danger. If Catherine's reluctance had earned the promise, someone else could experience that promise as rejection. And the conversation Charles had delayed with Camilla could no longer be postponed. Charles entered the conversation hoping for understanding. Instead, Elizabeth's letter exposed a wound neither he nor Camilla could easily hide. This was not simply about jewels or ceremonial privilege. It was about whose judgment would define the monarchy after Elizabeth's death. When Charles finally explained that his mother had personally reserved significant responsibilities for Catherine, Camilla's reaction transformed the private discussion into the most dangerous emotional confrontation yet. Charles kept the meeting private from the beginning. He asked aides to remain outside because he did not want Elizabeth's instructions spreading through the household before Catherine had even heard them herself. The king explained that his mother had separated certain personal possessions and symbolic duties from crown property. Crown property, in plain terms, belongs to the monarchy as an institution, rather than to one royal as private property. That distinction gave Catherine a protected place no casual family compromise could erase. Camilla listened without interrupting until the meaning became impossible to ignore. Then she asked whether Elizabeth had ever truly trusted her to help shape the monarchy beside Charles. The question hit harder than he expected. He tried to reassure his wife that Catherine's position did not diminish hers, but even he could hear how weak that sounded against the precision of his mother's words. The queen consort was not arguing about jewelry. She was asking whether she had ever been fully accepted. Camilla then revealed, through the private conversation itself, that she had once heard Elizabeth intended to leave Catherine something significant. She insisted she believed that meant possessions, perhaps a few personal pieces, nothing more. Charles corrected her. His mother had attached future ceremonial responsibility to the promise as well, giving Catherine something far more powerful than inheritance: visible continuity. Then the king read the sentence Elizabeth had written to prevent later alteration. The instruction made clear that the arrangement was not to be diluted, divided, or reinterpreted. Camilla stopped speaking. For Charles, that sentence removed the easiest solution he had left. He could not simply share the responsibility differently without violating the very wish he had been asked to protect. Camilla rose and pushed her chair back, but Charles quietly asked her to stay. She stopped. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then he placed the letter between them, and she asked the question he had been dreading. Would Catherine even accept something that could permanently change how both women were seen? Charles had no answer. Camilla could challenge Elizabeth's reasoning, but she could not control Catherine's choice. And now the Princess of Wales was about to discover what had been promised in her name. When Catherine finally saw Elizabeth's letter, the most extraordinary part was not the value of what had been promised. It was the authority hidden inside the wording. Elizabeth had not simply left family treasures to a beloved granddaughter-in-law. She had deliberately connected Catherine to a set of traditions, responsibilities, and decisions that would carry influence far into William's future reign. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether Charles wanted to honor his mother. It was whether he had any defensible reason not to. Catherine joined Charles and William in private, with no wider household present. The king explained where the letter had come from, when it had been sealed, and why Elizabeth had delayed its release. Provenance, in simple terms, means the documented history showing where an important object or document came from and how it was preserved. Only after that explanation did he place the pages in Catherine's hands. Catherine read slowly and discovered 3 separate promises. Elizabeth had designated personal keepsakes, selected jewelry, and stewardship over family traditions she believed should survive into the next generation. Stewardship meant responsibility for preserving and guiding something important, without treating it as personal property. The words moved Catherine more than the objects. Elizabeth had praised her consistency, restraint, and loyalty, making clear that trust had been earned through conduct rather than rank. Catherine's first fear was Camilla. She looked at Charles and asked whether honoring one woman's memory had to come at another woman's expense. The king hesitated because his mother had predicted exactly that response. He explained that Elizabeth had included language urging Catherine not to surrender the responsibility merely to avoid discomfort or family tension. The late queen had expected reluctance and had written against it. William then noticed another layer. Elizabeth had tied Catherine's stewardship to George, Charlotte, and Louis, describing the responsibility as protection for what they would one day inherit emotionally as well as ceremonially. That made the promise larger than Catherine herself. The prince understood that his grandmother had been thinking beyond one reign and toward the family that would carry the monarchy forward. Catherine closed the letter with both hands and asked Charles for no title, jewel, or privilege. She asked only whether accepting Elizabeth's wishes would damage his marriage. Then she gave him her condition. She would accept only if he truly believed it served the monarchy. Her question stripped away ceremony and inheritance. Charles could delay no longer. The king now had to decide what loyalty meant, and whom honoring the past might hurt in the present. And once that choice was made, there would be no quiet way to undo it, no harmless compromise, and no return to uncertainty. Charles had spent hours searching for a solution that would protect everyone. Elizabeth's letter had already made that impossible. Any compromise would weaken his mother's explicit instructions. Full acceptance would confirm Catherine's special place in Elizabeth's final vision. When the king finally made his decision, there was no dramatic proclamation and no crowd of courtiers, only one signature, one quiet sentence, and the immediate realization that his family would never view the promise quite the same way again. Charles reviewed the written instructions one final time before acting. He had already separated Elizabeth's personal wishes from broader royal holdings, meaning property attached to the monarchy itself, rather than privately owned by one family member. That distinction mattered, because it gave the king a clear path. Catherine would receive the keepsakes and jewels named for her, while also accepting stewardship of the traditions Elizabeth had deliberately placed in her care. The king signed with reluctance, not because he doubted Catherine. That was never the problem. He knew Camilla would hear something painful beneath the decision. Elizabeth had imagined part of the monarchy's future through another woman. Charles removed his glasses, set the pen down, and said quietly, "My mother made her choice." William did not answer. Catherine lowered her eyes, understanding exactly what the sentence had cost him. Catherine did not celebrate the outcome. She turned to William and asked him to give Charles space. The prince hesitated, then respected her request, because he could see that his father had just chosen duty over emotional comfort. Catherine remained subdued as well. The promise had become real, but so had the damage it might cause, and she refused to treat either consequence lightly. Camilla received confirmation shortly afterward through a private household briefing. She immediately understood that Charles had rejected any attempt to divide or reinterpret Elizabeth's instructions. The queen consort did not confront him. Instead, she withdrew from a planned family gathering later that day. Her absence was quiet, but impossible to miss, and Charles knew exactly what it meant. That silence hurt more than an argument might have. Charles had settled the legal and ceremonial question, but the emotional one remained open. Catherine had become the beneficiary of Elizabeth's final trust. Camilla had become the person most wounded by it, and the king stood between them, carrying both truths at once. That pressure finally pushed him toward a different kind of decision. He needed to speak to Catherine alone, not as monarch to future queen, but as a son still trying to understand his mother, a husband trying not to lose his wife, and a king learning what loyalty could demand. For all the documents, titles, and competing expectations surrounding Elizabeth's promise, the turning point came without any palace machinery at all. Charles asked Catherine to remain after William left, and for the first time since opening the letter, the king stopped speaking as monarch and spoke as a son. He admitted that what hurt most was not choosing between Catherine and Camilla. It was discovering that his mother had made one final decision about the monarchy without trusting him to understand it until after she was gone. Charles let the silence settle before continuing. No aides remained, no advisors stood between them, and no family member could soften what he was about to say. He explained that Elizabeth had kept planning beyond her own lifetime with extraordinary precision, even when those plans touched relationships she knew could become painful. A royal succession plan, in simple terms, is the preparation for how duties, responsibilities, and symbols pass from one generation to the next. For him, this one felt painfully personal. The king admitted the fear he had tried to hide. Honoring Elizabeth's promise could look like betrayal to Camilla, while ignoring it would feel like betrayal to his mother. Catherine listened without interrupting. When he finished, she told him she did not see the late queen's gift as a victory over anyone. She would not allow it to become proof that one woman had defeated another inside the royal family. Catherine then offered something Charles had not expected. She suggested preserving every part of Elizabeth's instructions while publicly framing the responsibility around service, continuity, and the next generation rather than status. The princess understood that the meaning could survive without turning the promise into a contest. Charles heard the idea and finally recognized the quality his mother had trusted all along. That realization changed him. Catherine had been handed influence, yet her first instinct was to make that influence smaller in public, not larger. She wanted the duty protected, not the power celebrated. The king understood then why Elizabeth had chosen her. The promise had never been about rewarding ambition. It had been about trusting someone who would resist using royal responsibility for personal advantage. Charles reached toward the sealed envelope before Catherine left, then paused. Instead of returning it to the archive, he handed it to her and said Elizabeth had written it for the future, and that future now belonged partly in her keeping. Catherine accepted it quietly. But peace inside the room created a new problem outside it. Charles knew speculation could not be allowed to define his mother's final wishes. A controlled announcement was now unavoidable, and once Elizabeth's promise became public, the monarchy would face an emotional reaction far beyond anything the family could contain. The moment Elizabeth's promise became public, the story escaped palace corridors and entered Britain's emotional memory. It was no longer merely about Charles feeling torn or Catherine accepting a private responsibility. People saw something larger, the late queen appearing, through her final instructions, to reach beyond her own reign and place deliberate trust in the woman expected to stand beside the next king. Within hours, one image outside Windsor captured the public mood more powerfully than any palace statement could. The palace confirmed that Elizabeth had left Catherine specifically designated personal pieces and entrusted her with preserving selected family traditions for the next generation. A palace statement, in simple terms, is an official public message issued on behalf of the royal household. The wording was carefully restrained. It emphasized continuity, personal discretion, and duty, avoiding any suggestion that the decision placed Catherine and Camilla in direct competition. Charles followed the reaction privately and quickly saw the danger he had feared. Headlines began comparing the two women, turning Elizabeth's private judgment into a public measure of loyalty and acceptance. The king had wanted the announcement to calm speculation, not inflame it. Catherine felt the same unease. She insisted that no celebratory language surround the news, because she refused to let the late queen's trust become something that looked like triumph over Camilla. Then the public response took on a different tone. Media discussion moved beyond the value of jewels and focused instead on the unusual precision of Elizabeth's instructions. Commentators examined why she had protected Catherine's role so carefully, and why the late monarch had connected it to future generations. The question was no longer what Catherine had received. It was why Elizabeth had trusted her so deeply. Outside Windsor Castle, that emotion became unmistakable. A small crowd gathered and began leaving flowers beside handwritten notes honoring both Elizabeth and Catherine. One widely broadcast television image showed a young girl placing a white rose beneath a card carrying 4 simple words: "For duty carried forward." The moment spread quickly. because it captured what many believed the promise really represented. That evening, a major broadcast framed the revelation not as a transfer of jewelry, but as Elizabeth's final endorsement of continuity between her reign and William's eventual monarchy. Charles watched the coverage and finally understood what he had resisted from the beginning. Honoring his mother did not require choosing Catherine against Camilla. It required accepting that both women could hold different places in the monarchy without one erasing the other. By nightfall, Britain had already given Elizabeth's promise its meaning. Charles still had one task left. He had to decide what the letter meant to him, not as monarch alone, but as son, husband, father, and king. Charles began this story torn between the woman beside him, the mother he had lost, and the future represented by Catherine. He ends it understanding that Elizabeth's promise was never designed to force that choice. Her letter did something more difficult. It demanded that he trust her judgment, even when it created discomfort in his own reign. Once Charles accepted that truth, the conflict surrounding the letter stopped being about inheritance and became a final lesson from one sovereign to another. Charles confirmed that Elizabeth's instructions would stand as written. Catherine accepted the responsibilities attached to them, but she refused to treat the decision as personal elevation. The arrangement would remain centered on preservation, family continuity, and preparing the next generation. Continuity, in royal terms, means carrying duties and traditions forward without allowing one reign to break the chain connecting past and future. That was the meaning Elizabeth had protected from the beginning. The king later spoke privately with Camilla and acknowledged the pain the decision had caused. He did not minimize it, and she did not pretend the outcome felt easy. Charles explained that changing his mother's wishes would have created a deeper wound because it would have turned Elizabeth's final judgment into something negotiable. Camilla accepted that the late queen's private decision belonged to her, even if accepting it required swallowing disappointment. Catherine made her own choice next. She decided that Elizabeth's most personal words would remain private rather than becoming part of a public campaign about royal favor. The princess understood that preserving the letter meant protecting the woman behind the crown, not merely the symbolism around it. William recognized the deeper gift as well. His grandmother had not simply handed Catherine treasures. She had trusted her with responsibility, because she believed duty would matter more to her than status. Charles finally understood the lesson completely. He had never truly been asked to choose Elizabeth over Camilla, or Catherine over either of them. He had been asked to accept that love, loyalty, and duty sometimes pull in different directions. Kingship, he now understood, could mean honoring the hardest promise precisely because it offered no easy path. The king returned alone to the desk, where he had first opened the letter. He did not reread it. He closed the archival box, rested his hand briefly on its lid, and walked away, knowing the decision was finished. Elizabeth's promise had not crowned a winner. It had confirmed that monarchy survives when duty is carried forward, without being turned into personal triumph. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.